Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we see the fall of Vuhledar. The Russians managed to gain full control over the city over the past 24 hours. We first saw a Russian push from the western flank towards the western parts of the city, where the Russians managed to gain control over the garages in the north, the apartment complex buildings in the west, and the hospital area in the south. With that flanking attack, the Russians caught the Ukrainians in the middle of a withdrawal out of the city. This allowed the Russians to take advantage of that to then push onwards towards the central parts of the city, gaining control over one apartment complex after another, to then push the Ukrainians completely out of the city under heavy fire by Russian artillery and drones throughout the whole time. The Ukrainians attempted a final withdrawal where they attempted to push out of the settlement during the night, in which the results really isn't known. There's been no reports on it. We can assume that some managed to escape and others didn't. And that is what reports have come out. It's a mix. And this brings us to the final geolocated footage over the Battle of Vuhledar, which ends on the 1st of October 2024. The battle, which began on the 28th of October 2022, now a year, 11 months, and 3 days later, has ended with a Russian victory. With this, we see that the Russians now have an open road towards Bohoyavlenka, Novokrenka, and the Ukrainian positions in between Velika Novosilka and Kurakhove. This entire area will now be attacked by the Russian forces in the coming weeks as they look to cut off the connection between Kurakhove and Velika Novosilka and push towards Konstantinopel, where the objective would be to meet the two front lines from Avdiivka in the north to Vuhledar in the south, as the Russians will now look to cut off Kurakhove by flanking them both from the north and the southern flanks and push towards the Dnipro region, cutting off the entire area in between the two. The objective of the Russians here will be a mix of doing the frontline advances they've been doing, allowing for a wide advance of the Russian forces. It is likely that the Russians will capture much more territory in this month of October than they did in the month of September, considering the Russians now having control over Vuhledar, the river line that blocked the area, and the Ukrainian defensive positions north of these areas are not sufficient to hold back future Russian offensive operations, especially with the casualties the 72nd Mechanized Brigade has suffered during the defense of the settlement. Here to the north of Kurakhove, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the rest of the industrial area. The mine remains under Ukrainian control, and the remaining parts of the railway between Hernik and Sukharine is now also under Russian control. This is following the capture of Ukrainsk. The Russians are now pushing in a southern direction. The objective here is to gain control over Sukharine and to bypass Hernik towards Novoselidivka. The Russian operations here continue along the railways and the settlements in between Hernik and Sukharine as they look to gain control over the northern parts of Kurakhove before pushing in the direction of Andriivka. Gaining control over Andriivka from the north and Constantinople from the south will allow the Russians to connect the two front lines from Vuhledar and Ukrainsk. Such an operation will be split into multiple phases. In the northern direction, the first phase is to reach Kurakhove by cutting off this entire area. This will force the Ukrainian positions here in the east by Hernik and the general settlements in the area to withdraw from this section of the front line, either towards Novoselidivka and then beyond, or towards Kurakhove. Both of these are within close proximity to Russian forces and will be under constant fire during this process. So the Russians are here looking to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the eastern section of the front line. The second phase of this section of the front line will be to gain control over Selidove and the road between Selidove towards Kurakhove here in the western parts. This will allow the Russians to cut off the connection completely between Pokrovsk in the north and Kurakhove in the south, before the Russians will push along this defensive line towards Andriivka to gain control over the settlement from the north. That is the third phase. In the south, north of Vuhledar, we see 3 phases as well. The first phase is to storm Novoukrayinka and Bohoyavlenka. The Russians are looking to do this as fast as possible before the Ukrainians gather their forces and establish proper defensive positions. The second phase is to gain control over Zolotarnyva and then the settlements in the next line of defense, all the way to the northern parts. So this would be Maximivka, Yasna Polyana, and so on. The third phase would be to connect with the northern parts to push towards Constantinople and so on. So we see that the push of the Russians will be along these senses, down south, then to the west, and directly in a northwestern direction. This will cut off the Ukrainian forces in this entire area here, between Kurakhove and the general settlements in the vicinity of the town. So we see that the Russian offensive operations will look to connect in this exact spot, and this will be the Russian operation here in the next coming weeks and month. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novosadove, just exactly like in the direction of Nevsky, just north of this, the Russians have started offensive operations to push towards the next settlement along the Siverskyi river line. They found a way that works and they continue doing it. They will continue down south along the river line all the way down to Sarishna and Torske as they continue pushing the Ukrainian positions in the area. The Russians have been continuing offensive operations along the Siverskyi river line all the way down south to the northern parts. And now there is a report from the Russian Ministry of Defense about the capture of Vishneve. This is a very interesting report because there has so far been no reports of Russian presence on the western bank of the Siverskyi river line, besides that of Stelmahivka. But we also heard reports such as the capture of Stelmahivka and Stepova Novoselivka, yet those have not happened yet. And several times the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to control Sinkivka here in the north before they actually got control of it. Therefore, we can assume that the soldiers fighting in this section of the front line tend to report about captures earlier than they actually happen. It is more likely that this is an announcement that they will be fighting in the direction of Vishneve and that assaults have taken place across Andrivka here by the Siverskyi river line. Therefore, we may look to see the Russians expanding their operations to cover the area beyond Stelmahivka and the Siverskyi river line here in the north before they storm the settlements along the Uska river line. They may use a tactic similar to that along the southern flank here by the Siverskyi river line to launch operations from Sinkivka towards Petropavlivka and continue along the river line, or to gain control over the area here near the crossing near Sinkova, to gain control of these settlements and then push in the northern direction to close the area between the northern and southern flank of the eastern bank of the Uska river line. In general, the Russian operations continue across the entire section of the front line, in the northern parts and in the southern parts, all the way to the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, as the Russians continue their offensive operations. The heaviest fighting right now is in the direction of Toretsk, as well as in the direction of Pokrovsk, along the fortified line here by Lysivka, in the direction of Sukharina, where the Russians are flanking from the south, attacking from the east, and storming from the north, attacking the settlement from 3 separate directions. Gaining full control over the railway between Herenik and Sukharina as well strengthens the Russian positions here to prevent the Ukrainians from flanking them and counterattacking from the east. Generally, the Russians are now in a position where they have gained an extreme advantage in several sections of the front line here in the Donetsk region from the Ukrainians not sending enough troops and launching the Kursk offensive. This allowed the Russians to improve their positions, and they have been improved enough for more active operations to take place. And if we take a look at the weather reports, we see that the high temperatures and sun continues. There's no rain incoming. Despite it, we have already reached October, yet the ground is not muddy yet. There's not been that much rain, if any, and this means that generally the offensive operations continue. There's no hindrance in terms of weather or seasonal changes, and this has allowed the Russians to capitalize on their success and to continue their offensive operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.